If you've ever seen any of my Taste of the Unexplainable videos, then you're aware I have, on occasion, received various sorts of messages through my subconscious. But in the few videos I've done, I've had little time to go over the full range of my experiences, and to fill in the blanks a bit. About 20 years ago, I started meditating. I'd sit quietly, close my eyes, and observe the cavernous space that seemed to be my empty mind. The space in there, if I can call it that, seemed like a dark, deserted theater to start, and later, as my awareness grew, a dark, vacant stadium, with me the only occupant. Keeping your mind empty is difficult, and thoughts and questions would sometimes manifest, like dark clouds on a night sky. The technique I used was to notice those thoughts and then let them slide on by without thinking about them, without getting drawn into them. Work items, finances, how I would spend my time. These day-to-day issues were easy to suppress after a while. It was the deeper, more soul-searching questions that were a problem. They'd pull your mind in before you'd realize it. Questions like, why am I here? What's the purpose of life? Is there someone listening to my mind? Is there a God or angels watching over us? After a while, I started noticing a little mental whisper way in the back of my mind, trying to answer those questions. Sometimes they'd ask me to refine my question and then answer. The beginnings of interaction. Their answers were at first curious and then intriguing, so I started writing them and my conversations down, and I've been doing that now for over 20 years. I've become completely comfortable with this process. It's almost like a hobby or game. I hate skimming past those 20 years, but that's a different story, and maybe I'll get around to telling it one day. There's so much more I want to tell you. But to quickly summarize those years, the whispers from my subconscious, superconsciousness, or whatever you want to call it, always spoke in the language of my belief systems. If I think I were talking to God, Jesus, Buddha, Muhammad, Shiva, angels, or whatever, the responses always seem to be coming from that God, deity, or that particular personality. I just accepted that as the way the game worked. Its ground rules, so to speak. And another thing, the answers I got from them wouldn't shake up my belief systems by revealing amazing new insights. No. Instead, they answered in a way that satisfied my immediate curiosity, like the way a parent might answer a young child. But as I kept track of what was said and asked follow-on questions, I started to see their answers leading me upward toward mental maturity, to something greater than I originally believed. This came naturally, because I thought about everything I wrote down. I even cross-referenced ideas that came up again and again. It was a hobby, so why not? I saw this as my job, to question things and see where the answers led. This was a fun thing. I probed areas of interest and gaps in what they said. The answers I got never seemed to outright contradict one another, which I always thought curious. I wondered how this coherency could be happening, sometimes linking material and ideas said over the span of months. Wasn't my mind just making this stuff up on the fly? Apparently not, and this is what made the game interesting. Of course there might be gaps in explanation, which I'd probe with questions, but no real impasse, no inconsistencies or logic problems that would invalidate the game. During those years, I didn't care who was answering my questions, nor ask who was speaking. I didn't see the point. I couldn't verify anything, and the whole notion of assigning names to my subconscious seemed illogical, an unnecessary complication. But by the time 18 years rolled around, I felt something new and interesting might happen, because I had outgrown the space of my initial beliefs. It wasn't so much that new beliefs replaced them, It was more like the space of my beliefs had expanded. My old beliefs were nothing more than a seed laying somewhere on the ground of that dark mental stadium I talked about. Now there's one curious thing I ought to mention here, and that's the clicks, pops, and wall taps I might hear while meditating. At first I wasn't even aware of them because I was playing light music in the background. But later I wanted a stronger connection with my meditative state and turned the music off and lowered the lights. That's when I started noticing them. It wasn't so much they were a distraction. It was their uncanny timing, the way I'd hear them after thoughts or ideas flashed into my mind. Sitting quietly and serenely, I'd suddenly hear a word or phrase register in my mind, a mental whisper. Then immediately hear a click, pop, or tap on the wall nearby, usually in the direction I was facing. Of course I tried to ignore this synchronicity, I guess you might call it, but it kept happening, like it was drawing my attention to the words that just flew by, like I was supposed to think about them. This is how I started paying attention to the whispers in my mind. It also brings up an interesting concept, and one which I'm sure you're well aware, but something that's too much of a coincidence is not a coincidence. Now, more recently, about 2 years ago, I started reading about the self-realization movement. Briefly, this is a worldwide organization founded by Paramahansa Yogananda, a rigorously trained and ordained Indian Swami Guru. He and his organization taught self-realization, and you can read more about him and his organization, the Self-Realization Fellowship, online or by reading his book, Autobiography of a Yogi. Self-realization sounded interesting because, in my own way, I seemed to be headed in that direction myself. Had he discovered some interesting secrets or methodologies? I went exploring the literature to find out. In my study, there were two personalities that especially attracted my attention. I think they would be called saints or avatars in different countries. These were Nirmala Sundari and Babaji. Babaji, the mysterious forefather of the self-realization movement, was credited for living several hundred years and appearing and disappearing at will. Nirmala, an Indian female saint or avatar, also known as Ananda Mai Ma, lived around the early 20th century and also preached religious freedom and self-realization, the notion of perfecting one's spiritual existence in tune with the universe. I strongly related to their ideas, the concepts of finding your own way and realizing that God and spiritual evolution lay within yourself. It just made sense. One night I rather whimsically addressed Babaji during meditation, saying, "Do you know who Paramahansa Yogananda is?" I frankly wanted to see whether my mind would get tripped up, asking such a sly, complex question. The answer came back crystal clear. He was my protégé. My head fell backward. I never said the word protégé before. Yet it flowed effortlessly into my mind, and that was the most concise, correct answer. You'll see this happening many times as you read on, this unexpected correctness. You have to pay attention to little details like this. They mean something. P.S. Protégé. Definition. A person who is guided and supported by an older and more experienced or influential person. And just a note here, if you see me posting a definition, it's because I didn't know or wasn't completely clear what the speaker meant saying that word. I looked it up afterwards while writing up my notes. In any case, that incident with Babaji opened the doors for me asking other questions. My question and answer sessions with both he and later Nirmala each revealed their own unique personality, something I hadn't given attention to in the past. For example, Babaji's responses didn't get bogged down in the details. Rather, he saw things from the high view. When I asked him a question, I'd equate his responses as coming from a high-level manager. One night he told me his job was to help people make uplifting connections, and I needed to express my goals to the universe more often, he said, mentally, or in what people might think of as prayer, because he and others heard these telepathic thoughts and assisted by connecting you with the right persons, entities, and forces that could help. When I asked him about the entities and forces trying to deceive and inhibit the enlightenment process, he told me,
"Don, you have an infinite mind. Don't be waylaid by its intricacies. Let simplicity be your guide."
Once again, a high-level view. Nirmala, on the other hand, had a distinctly feminine point of view, which I found refreshingly different and educational. She was like a big sister in all things related to spiritual evolution. Some of what she told me is too personal to mention here, and there were times she didn't want to talk much at all, like she was too busy or worried about something, which struck me odd. But the most obvious takeaways were I was now talking to named individuals with different and recognizable personalities. Between the two of them, Nirmala and Babaji, I had a comfortable connection with ready spiritual advice, if and when I needed it. Their names will come up a few times in what follows. Now, I don't actually hear a recognizable voice when I hear these mental whispers. It's more like a generic voice, a one-whisper-fits-all sort of thing, and this may have something to do with the way telepathy works. In the case of Babaji and Nirmala, their personalities were recognizable only by what they said, the way they thought, the way their ideas were organized. I cannot, and to this day still can't, recognize individual speakers by the sound of their whisper, though my skill is still developing. Now, more recently, I took a course in remote viewing, and what I found most interesting, and pay special attention to this, was the same type of mental whispers I'd been hearing and recording for the past 20 years, were the same whispers describing the remote targets I was trying to perceive, and they did so with considerable accuracy. You can see examples of this in my YouTube videos. So, after 20 years, I finally had this big realization. The mental whispers and conversations I'd been writing down were not just a game, nor were they gibberish. They had real value, as did the techniques I used to hear and record my conversations. They all came from a meditative state that I presume anyone can tap into with practice. The question comes up on every occasion whether I'm really talking to the personalities, Nirmala and Babaji, and I certainly appreciate that question myself. To be honest, I don't know and probably never will. I don't see them, they don't appear to me, and would that even be definitive proof? On the other hand, this question loses most of its significance when I considered the quality of the information I was receiving. Their answers always made good sense, often going well beyond any preconceived ideas, offering points of view I found mind-expanding and enlightening. In short, their responses served my immediate needs, always moving me forward, and to me, that was the only thing really important. I should also mention their responses were always perceived by me in English, but they sometimes used words I had to look up in the dictionary, words I was uncertain about or never used before. Babaji once told me,
"You're like a method actor. You learn something, then crescendo."
I didn't know what a method actor was, and I thought crescendo meant grow quieter. When I looked it up, it meant the opposite, to grow louder. And of course, a method actor is one who tries to improve their performance by immersing themselves with their subject. Again, pay attention to these unexpected details. Begin story. Because of the recent successes I've had with remote viewing, it occurred to me I should probably send my mind out to learn new things. I had several astoundingly accurate perceptions during my remote viewing practice, and after you experience this sort of thing for yourself, you begin to realize the power of the mind and its ability to travel the universe and through time. While taking the remote viewing course, my teacher discussed the case of Skinny Bob, a video someone posted on YouTube. Their 8mm film showed what appeared to be a gray alien or extraterrestrial wandering somewhere in Russia around 1940. The video had official government markings, and I'll post a link to this video below. Nobody knew whether the alien in the film was real, so my teacher set up a remote viewing project to investigate. In remote viewing, you're never told what you're supposed to perceive. You intentionally keep the conscious mind blank about the objectives by using target numbers. Each person is given a target ID number that secretly assigns them to view different aspects, in this case of the ET, where it came from, was it a hoax, real, and so on. Their job was to record whatever perceptions they felt while trying to connect psychically to their target ID. Surprisingly, the remote viewers reported the ET was not only from another planet, but it also perceived them, the remote viewers themselves, coming as they were from the present to view him in the past, back in 1940. He asked them why they kept coming back to observe him, and seemed annoyed with them doing so. What I got out of this story was a remote viewer could actually communicate with someone even if they lived in the past, if the subject being observed had telepathic abilities. Now let me read that again. A remote viewer could actually communicate with someone even if they lived in the past, if the subject being observed had telepathic abilities. Now that might include beings like this ET, and maybe even some human saints. And that gave me an idea. Could I, with my meditation, mental whispers, and now remote viewing practice, contact a friendly extraterrestrial myself? One night I directed my mind to connect me with a technologically advanced ET. Not just any extraterrestrial, mind you, but one that was friendly and wouldn't mind talking to me. I wanted this being to be alive now, in the present, like me, not living in the past, and have goals similar to mine, including interests in general intellectual progress and spiritual and mental advancement. My dialogue with him begins just after the mental connection was made. April 3rd, 2019. My mind announced,
"He is approaching and will adhere."
Adhering is telepathy speak for good connection. As usual, there were no visuals. My eyes were closed, and what I perceived were mental whispers. The extraterrestrial ET introduced himself in a friendly way. When I asked if he were willing to talk to me, he dove right in. I asked if he had a name, but suggested we proceed without one, since he correctly pointed out I tend to get tripped up on tricky pronunciations. He then started telling me he had a body and he lived on a world similar to ours and was a mathematician. The conversation was incredibly smooth. I couldn't believe I was hearing all this in my mind. Note, I'll be using phrases like "he told me" or "I said" or "heard" with some liberty. Everything occurred entirely in my mind, but I think of them as regular conversations. The only difference was I composed and voiced my words mentally. And while we're on the topic of writing conventions, I use the headings PS and Note frequently, but they mean different things. Comments labeled PS were things I didn't realize until well after I typed up my notes of the conversation. In other words, I typed PS comments hours or days later as part of my analysis. But notes are things I knew at the time and just am sharing with you now so we're all on the same page. I asked him about his health care, and he said their medical practices were far more advanced, and that they could live upward of 800 or 1,000 years or more, with even longer lifetimes available to the highborn. I've never said the word highborn before. Interesting. When I asked him about their religious customs and whether there were tensions along belief lines, he said that some believed in a closed system and others in an open system. He said he related to me because I believed in an open system, and further admitted that there were tensions and frictions between these two systems. I was immediately impressed. His description cleverly described our own earthly religious practices. A closed system might be a religion that insists you belong or perish. An open system might be more like the universe is alive and filled with conscious beings ranging from simple to godlike. I was polite when I spoke, using phrases like "yes, please" and phrasing questions in a thoughtful, considerate way. I was having fun, and he seemed to be enjoying our cultural exchange. He even commented favorably about my conversation style several times. Then I remembered reading about some ET cultures not having sex because their bodies were manufactured, and reincarnation explicitly controlled when a new body was needed. He told me they did have sex, though they didn't adhere to it like you do. I understood this to mean they were not preoccupied with thoughts about sex or notions of personal beauty. Maybe they all looked the same. He seemed so friendly and everything seemed so reasonable and logical that at one point I asked him if it were possible to join their society. I was just being curious. I liked the idea of longer life, better health care, and more sophisticated technology. I also heard that human beings were confined to this planet after death through some unseen mind control force. Those same forces may also be responsible for erasing memories between lifetimes. In any case, I was curious to see if he would mention it. He said joining their society was possible in rare circumstances and would require an interview. He didn't say it, but I got the feeling such an interview would involve hard-to-contact personalities in his own realm. Note: this was the first time the notion of an interview ever came up in any of my mental conversations, and this also intrigued me. An interview for what? I wondered. My next incarnation? Wow, pretty mind-expanding. Over the years, I've had many Q&A sessions and wrote tons of whispered answers out like a game. But while playing, you continually wonder whether it's real or not. It's all coming from your subconscious, so you obviously can't see who you're speaking to. But sometimes you start getting the feeling the information is authentic. The words and conversation starts flowing in directions different from your own ideas. This conversation was starting to fall into that category. We went on talking a bit longer. It was sort of like chit-chat. He asked about my interests, and I tried to answer as best I could, considering I was laying in bed with my eyes closed. Still, the conversation was so interesting at one point, I asked him whether he was a professional recruiter. His speech, or maybe what he was describing, sounded so attractive. Next thing I knew, I had fallen asleep and woke up around 5:30 a.m. to hear a loud thud on the wall, and words blasting in my mind.
You will need to pass a combat test.
Or gauntlet, or some words to that effect. The tone of the voice sounded concerned, and this concerned me. I'm a 69-year-old man and not about to go off to boot camp. I fell back asleep. April 4th, 2019, 24 hours later. About 1:30 a.m. About a half an hour after I went to bed, there were several loud thuds on the bedroom wall to my left. In my experience, thuds like these can sometimes be like door knocks from mental energies that have something to say. I often respond mentally. Anybody there have something to say to me? We need to chat. Okay, sure. What's up? Do not fear. Whoa, never heard that before. My adrenaline shot up. It seemed something important was about to happen. I'm not fearful, I said. Not at all. We suggest you not move. Okay, I thought in response. I was laying eyes closed happily on one side with the covers up to my neck. What I heard next was something like, "Lift him up. Okay, we've got him." While this side conversation continued, I felt absolutely no body movement or shaking in the bed. If they were lifting something, it was some non-physical part of me. You should hear us much clearer now. We understand you're interested in joining our organization. These words were said with such a sharp, direct coolness, I could tell they were deadly serious. His tone seemed to convey routine boredom, though, perhaps military. Before answering, I considered for a moment. Was I really interested in joining? Like, what is their organization, anyway? What am I getting into? Well, the voice I spoke with the other night seemed very pleasant. Was this an opportunity to join his civilization, or some interplanetary workforce? I had no idea. I finally put all of that out of my mind because the interview he mentioned seemed to be occurring right now, and I had to come up with an answer. Yes, I'm interested. What qualifications do you bring us? Again, a routine boredom in tone. Wow, these people get right to the point. I kept my cool. I started talking about how I was a career programmer, trained to think logically and systematically, and how I enjoyed working with technology and scientific concepts in the communication industry. I mentioned my places of work, which included Bell Labs, AT&T, Lucent, Avaya, and Verizon Wireless. Since that seemed to go pretty fast, I started talking about the computers I had at home and how I was skilled at both using and maintaining them. Finally, I mentioned I was retired, but continued my education by taking online courses, and I had good audio and video editing skills, and even published some videos on YouTube. I stopped to consider what else I should say. They countered with the rather emotionless, "We are interested already." I took a sigh of relief, then started wondering what questions I might ask them. Do you work individually or in groups? I was wondering if they were a collective mind, but their answer indicated they did both. When I asked, "Do you socialize? Do you have humor?" "We exchange ideas." And while I don't believe they said it, I got the feeling there was enjoyment in their mental exchanges. Then I started wondering about their work ethic. Did they work for a time, then have hours off like we do? I explained I had artistic talents that I'd like to further develop. To this, I got the rather startling response, "Don't tell me about that." This was said so emphatically, I jumped. I quickly reconsidered. It seemed like their work ethic was tireless, non-stop, something a human can't do because we need rest. But if their bodies don't tire, then working in a suitably interesting environment is probably ideal. Okay, I'm not going to worry about that for now. I refocused. P.S. It took me some moments to come to this conclusion, but they didn't seem to have a problem with my intervening mental silence. It occurred to me later that maybe their telepathic capabilities extended into my deepest mind. They may have enjoyed watching me puzzle over their response, like to see how I handled it. It now occurred to me this interview was far too blind. I had no idea who I was dealing with, so I asked if there was some way I could see them. They responded that they couldn't converse while projecting. I presumed this meant they had to switch gears or something, So I remained silent and waited. "What do you see?" My eyes were closed, remember, so I tried to perceive through my mind, but frankly, I didn't know what I was doing. I answered, "Vague shadows, shadowy movements in my mind, and now nothing but blackness." "You are operating in a blackout. This needs to be corrected." I had no idea what that meant, but I got the general impression humans had poorly developed clairvoyance. But while I was thinking about it, I started feeling as though something were pressing my eyes wider apart, like my left eye moving further left and my right eye moving further right. This feeling continued for about 2 hours after, and it kept me restless with a mild headache. By the way, and this needs to be said somewhere, so I'll put it here, I was really surprised how smoothly my mental conversation flowed. Sometimes in life my speech is fragmented and broken, but I had no such difficulties in this mental space. I started to wonder during the conversation if my physical body, my speech, had trouble keeping up with my mind. An interesting realization, and perhaps one you can only have when you experience this kind of mental freedom. Again, they remarked on the clarity of my mental speech. I'm trying to remember how the interview ended. I think it just dissolved with someone saying something like, "We will take these details into consideration," and that was it. I was doing all of this with my eyes closed, remember, but the conversation felt engagingly real. I asked if it were now okay to move, since I was comfortably motionless the whole time. The answer I got back was, "Don, you're doing well." I presumed I was now speaking with the ET I chatted with the other evening, and I chuckled. "So, what happens next?" "They will get back. That could take some time." Note, I've heard this sort of thing before, mental conversations that promise and don't deliver. The mental world is full of playfulness, it seems, and I started thinking maybe this wasn't real. But I certainly wanted to see what would happen next. This concluded the meeting, but about 10 minutes later there was a loud rap near the front window. Then I heard a mental voice say,
"You look a stranger."
This was a very different and deep mental voice. I got the impression, for lack of better terminology, it was a spirit or consciousness that lived in the building materials of our home. You'll learn about these things as you meditate and become aware of the background chatter. Apparently, it realized something extraordinary entered my bedroom. I wasn't sure what that meant, but 30 seconds later, I heard a quiet side conversation saying, "His cerebral cortex is functioning perfectly, beautifully." And then a minute later, "His mental activity is above normal." Something was inspecting me physically. Perhaps they wanted to know how fit and capable I was. Next, I think it was the original ET, said, "I need to know if you're serious. I need you to sign this if you are." Sign what? The blackness of my closed eyes? I grinned. Okay, let me think about this for a second. Based on the limited information I had, I said, "Everything seems to be very positive so far." He rather excitedly said, "Okay, sign here." What a startling conversation. No dream ever asked me for my signature before. What am I signing anyway? A document that lives in the mental world? I told him that while I was seriously interested, signing his document was not a firm commitment because I was still lacking information, and he agreed to that. So I mentally imagined a white space and signed my name with big flowery letters. He seemed very excited, and that concluded the meeting. His last statement was, "I'm going to do everything I can to try to acquire you." Then I heard another voice say, "Every time you traverse space-time, you'll receive a bounty." What did that mean? After that, I was literally overwhelmed by an onslaught of mental congratulation messages.
Congratulations, Don. You did well. We're so happy for you.
The next 30 or 40 seconds were filled with attaboys flowing into my mind, each apparently voiced by another unseen individual. This only confused me further to the state of alarm. Now very concerned, I tried to contact Nirmala. "What's going on?" I said. The words I heard back were,
"I can't be seen here, but let me whisper in your ear. You've done so well. I am so proud of you. You have been evaluated by a group, and the results are very favorable."
Her words struck me as being more joyful than usual. I also found curious her statement, "I can't be seen here," almost as though she were trying to conceal herself from detection. Remember, these telepathic beings can sense the presence of others, and her discovery might have caused a disruption. How interesting. Even in the telepathic world, there's a sense of privacy and decorum. In any case, her words sounded super positive. It seemed like everybody knew what was going on, except me. I tried reaching out to Babaji, the forefather of the self-realization movement, and he responded,
"They are very powerful. You're doing well. Nothing to worry about. Just play along and see what they offer you. Don't look back now. All forward."
I ended up thinking about his statement over and over till I finally fell asleep. Perhaps 5 minutes after that, I was awakened by these mental words. "He still has to pass the combat." Combat? What is this combat thing? I made a mental note to ask about it in the morning, then fell asleep again. P.S. I did ask about it when I woke up, and the response I heard back was, "That's a misunderstanding. They know everything you are thinking, including your secret fantasies." "But that doesn't hurt your chances. They should have everything together and get back to you in about a month's time." April 8th, 2019. 4 days later. I went to bed early around 10 p.m., turned out the lights and pulled the covers up. 10 minutes later I heard the familiar thud on the wall to my left, and I mentally responded, "Hello, anyone have messages for me?" "Don, be patient for a moment." This was another first. Never heard that before. I laid in silence for perhaps 20 seconds waiting. Then,
"I think you're perfect for this job. You have my vote."
Now what's going on? 20 seconds later,
"Your credentials seem to be ideal. And you have my vote too."
"So far so good, Don. Please be patient. The next board member has a question about your background." Oh my, I thought. Now what have they dug up? Maybe this is where things get embarrassing. I waited in silence.
"I have a question. You have an interest in math?"
I started thinking about the math courses I took in high school and the ones I had trouble with in college. These memories breezed through my mind in an instant. Were they actually reading my mind now? Did I actually think those thoughts? Or were they somehow extracted from my mind at high speed, like a movie played at fast forward? I responded now with careful accuracy. Yes, when I had good teachers, I did well and felt inspired. But when I was instructed by half-hearted teachers, I was confused, like in college. But we formed a study group, and there was one among us who was a math whiz. He could decompose any problem into simpler parts that seemed trivial to understand. I stopped for a moment of silent appreciation, recalling how skilled my friend Frank was at differential equations. Everything seemed to be so easy after he explained it to us. Then I realized I had nothing else to say, so I concluded, "I guess that's all."
"Well, I've heard enough. You have my vote. We need more self-starters like you.
Self-starters, what's that? After about 10 more seconds, I heard,
You have my vote too. History will prove our decision correct on this.
A curious comment. More on this later. Then almost immediately,
I hold the last and deciding vote in this meeting. And you have mine too. I think you're an ideal candidate.
I couldn't help but feel a touch of pride. I think I had just gotten through my first all-telepathic job interview. I started chuckling and then blurted out something like, "Thank you, and I appreciate your consideration." But in the back of my mind, I still, secretly, had no concrete idea what was going on. "That's it then, Don. There's one last item to be resolved. The board requires an affidavit certifying your authenticity. Sorry about that. You can blame the board for that." An affidavit? That sounds like a document, a transcript of grades or something. Actually, what might be better is my resume. I have my resume, the one I use for job employment. They accurately summarize everything I've done and the teams I've worked with over the years. But there's a problem. That information doesn't exist in a single place. For my last resume, I removed 10 or 15 years of experience to appear younger. Those were difficult years in job market. Companies seemed to prefer more junior employees at the time. And another thing, I'm retired now, and after I found my last job, I didn't need to update my resume anymore. But there is a summary of the work I did at Verizon Wireless on LinkedIn, though. Do you want me to find all of these pieces and coalesce them into a single document? How would I get that to you anyway? Don, that won't be necessary. I will convey to them exactly what you told me, and I'm sure that will be sufficient. Congratulations, Don. We welcome you with open arms. Now you have questions. Now you have questions was so anticlimactic, I started chuckling. Remember, my eyes were closed, in bed, everything was darkness. I felt like I was being razzle-dazzled with a black bag over my head. Well, yeah, let's start with what kind of assignment are we talking about here? You will work for me in advanced design. We will be planning your future based on the information we gather about you now. Together, we'll work things out. You have a strong aptitude for engineering and science, which makes us think you're ideally suited for advanced engineering and mathematics departments, propulsion and combinatorics. P.S. Have you ever said the word combinatorics before? Neither have I. Definition: combinatorics, the branch of mathematics dealing with combinations of objects belonging to a finite set in accordance with certain constraints, such as those of graph theory. Okay, interesting. So how does our relationship work then? Do I work with you now, like in this body? Or are we talking about after I transition to a new body? We think you're gifted and capable of working with us and others in your time frame, here on this planet. At your demise, we will intercept and attach ourselves to you and transition you to your new home. Okay, thank you. Here's another one. When I was talking to the board, they seemed to think I would be getting into mathematics. Is that right? Yes, they're interested in the future and mathematics, which is their shining light. I was getting pretty groggy at this point, and suggested we continue at another time. But just before falling asleep, though, I tried to reach out to Nirmala again. Can you please tell me in simple terms what's going on?
You now face eternity. You chose the path of logic. Everyone is very pleased.
That's the last thing I remember. April 9th, 2019. I woke up this morning around 5 a.m. to the usual thud on the bedroom wall. When I mentally asked if there were any messages for me in the usual way, I heard the following. We need to speak. We will need an account through which we can reimburse you for expenses. Okay. You will be given an ungratiated, fabricated doll body that will last upward of 1,000 years. You will work for the organization forever.
Wow.
An aptitude test is being prepared for you. Don't be afraid. Taking it will help us discover your weaknesses and strengths.
Okay.
By the way, the board meeting may have seemed on short notice, but what we want you to know is we spent considerable effort investigating you, and your credentials are impeccable. It'll be a pleasure working with you. We got a sense of your abilities when we discovered you knew something about us already.
I presume you knew something about us already meant the book I read recently by Lawrence R. Spencer. It discussed the notes recorded in 1947 by Roswell, New Mexico nurse Matilda O'Donnell McElroy, who discussed her involvement and later telepathic conversations with the single ET survivor from the Roswell flying saucer crash. Topics in the book include prefabricated doll bodies, managed reincarnation, prehistoric Earth conditions, intergalactic squabbles over this planet's ownership, and other fascinating topics. I'll put the link to this book below.